In the last video, I asked, are shadowy disaster makers causing the growth in risk? And how? To try and answer those questions, I'm going to take you to New York. So, there's this guy standing in the midst of a crowd of protesters outside Wall Street, the hub of the American finance industry. This is a protest, and there's nothing unusual about that except the guy who's doing the talking is not a protester or a campaigner. He's an academic, an economist, a Nobel Prize winner. His name is Joe Stiglitz. And this fascinates me because of a particular thing that he said there. There's a system where we privatise the gains and socialise the risks. That word risks made my ears prick up because risk is at the heart of what disasters are all about. This protest happened a couple of years after the big financial crash of 2008 and 2009, the credit crunch, which nearly led to the collapse of the financial system, making huge gains for people in the finance organisations who created and managed them, but creating huge risk, and the consequences of that were socialised for all of us. At that time I was working in East Africa, and there I saw that prices doubled and sometimes quadrupled, and people were struggling there just the same as in the rest of the world. The risks were socialised to us all. Look at small-scale, everyday disasters through Joe Stiglitz's eyes, and you can see the same thing happening. We saw how people in Bwaise in Uganda found their homes, schools and shops awash, not because of some major storm event, but because the regular seasonal rains all got channelled into the low-lying slum areas. Fast-paced building in a city centre makes big gains for the developers, who deal with the increasing drainage problems by routing wastewater into those areas. And the rains are getting worse because of climate change, resulting from uncontrolled energy consumption, mainly in rich countries. So the race for profit leads to increasing risks in Bwaise. In Kathmandu, our colleagues showed us buildings on the city streets which had been restricted to 4 stories after the massive 1934 earthquake to reduce the risk when another earthquake hit. But then they showed us the stories built on top of them and on the sides of these buildings, ignoring planning laws, creating more and more cheap housing for poor people migrating from the countryside looking for work. These magnified the risk of collapse, blocked roads and injuries when the next earthquake came. The building was done often by absentee landlords living away from the centre, making private gains from this dangerous overdevelopment. But the risks fell on everyone in the city, not on those landlords. They took the gains and the risks were socialised. So what Joe said is really interesting as a description of that massive financial disaster, the financial crash. But it's also a description, which is what attracted me to it, of the nature of disasters more generally. It turns the spotlight on the disaster makers, those who make quick gains but create increased risk for those often least able to cope with it. We've moved a long way from the idea of disasters being inescapable, unpredictable, large-scale events. Many are unreported everyday disasters, and whether disaster events are large or small, they're shaped in many cases by human choices, by those I call disaster makers. So we need to take a step back and ask what factors combine to create disasters large and small. It's complicated. For example, a big event like a volcanic eruption isn't necessarily a disaster. So what is, and what can we do about them? We're going to look at the science behind disasters in the next video. If you found this video useful in understanding disasters, subscribe to this channel as we explore disaster makers and check out the Disaster Makers book.